Hey, Pacific Southwest District. This is Pastor Dominic Rivkin, your Mission and Ministry Executive. And I was just thinking about a Bible verse that was shared with me back about 7 years ago by a dear, dear friend. He is a retired pastor here in Los Angeles. And he shared the words of Jesus from Mark chapter 12, where Jesus is asked what the most important commandment is. And he says, well, the most important one is love the Lord your God, right? With all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And we've all heard that verse over and over again. But this pastor really focused on the last part of it, to love yourself and what that means. That, in fact, if we don't really know what our relationship is one-to-one with God and know just how loved we are and really receive that love in and of ourselves, it's really, really hard to love others effectively. And in a situation like this, like we're all facing with COVID-19, it's very important that self-care become a priority for us as leaders in the church and in the schools of our district. So thinking about that and talking to President Gibson, we both agreed that there was a really great person that we could speak to about this. And it's retired Navy Chaplain Rob Crossan. And Rob is serving right now up in Anza, California, as a vacancy pastor, really helping out that congregation as he goes through training for intentional interim ministry. All of these things are really liminal, but boy, the chaplaincy is one that that a lot of us don't really know much about. But self-care in the context of chaplaincy is critical. And there's really nobody better to talk to about that. So I want to introduce you to Rob Crossan. And Rob, just tell us a little bit about your experience in 30 years as a Navy chaplain and what that was like. Let me
and for which I will always be grateful. And the interesting thing about it is that as I look back on it, the best of ministry, oddly enough, happened at the worst of times. I always considered my experience in combat, where I was surrounded by death and carnage, as the most powerful ministry I was ever a part of, and I wouldn't undo that for anything. Being there in those moments, and I think one of the things I learned was that the power of my presence was not necessarily in any words I spoke, but it was in just the fact of being there, what we call ministry of presence. And that was important, particularly with my younger chaplains, because when I was over in Afghanistan, I had a number of chaplains, of course, underneath me that were at the ground level. They were working with the battalions. And I would say the most important part of my job was to get out there and to see them and to care for them and to pulse them and see how they were holding up in every respect, physically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually, so that they could do their job and hold up for the people that they were working with, because they, like me, were seeing death and carnage on a daily basis. We were making trips to the morgue daily, to the hospital, to see what was left of people that had been blown up and managed somehow to survive. And I certainly learned that the power of it wasn't in any magical words I spoke, but just in my presence. The cross that I wore on the left lapel spoke volumes to people. It said that God is here even in the midst of this. And I think our callers say the same thing to people in a crisis like COVID. And I think some of the same experiences that you experience out of combat are going to be some of the experiences that we're going to have to deal with COVID. You're going to have guilt in many, many directions. In a combat situation, it's survivor's guilt. Why did I make it? And why did the buddy next to me not make it? Why did he get blown up and I didn't get blown up? Why am I alive? And there's going to be guilt that's going to come up in COVID, particularly if you come to realize maybe I brought it to my children, or I brought it to my parents or my grandparents. And it's not legitimate guilt, and we have to help people to deal with it. But that guilt is going to be there in many, many directions. Not to mention, again, survivor's guilt too. Those of us who make it through this are going to feel that same guilt about those who didn't. Why me? Why not them?
Yeah, there's a lot of pitfalls and a lot of perils that I know are coming. This situation is fluid, and I think you'd agree it's going to disintegrate probably even a little bit more for people on how they stay centered. How, especially our pastors and leaders, remember that cross that they're wearing is a cross that's for them as well. So, what were some of the techniques that you helped chaplains with as far as it came to self-care and how they were staying connected with Christ?
Well, I would talk to them, and I would just basically want to hear their story. Sometimes there's healing in just hearing the story. So somebody can be actively present to another person and just let them tell their story. That can be powerfully healing. That you have somebody that's just there for one reason, in this case me, to hear your story and to listen actively, which is hard work. That's not something that just happens. And I think that sometimes out of that, then they're going to be in a better position to be able to listen and hear others as well. I think that there are a lot of other tips that I would point out. You've got to force yourself to eat and drink at regular intervals. You need to get some sleep. You cannot operate without sleep, without food, without drink, without physical exercise. I mean, even in the midst of combat, I found myself trying almost religiously to do my elliptical for an hour, carve out an hour somewhere in that day just to do elliptical so that I could keep myself in some kind of a reasonable physical shape in the midst of that. So those are the kinds of things that happen. And then that translates to people. I was telling you earlier, Dominic, the story of standing outside the surgical tent and waiting for at Edinburgh. It was the first stop in that golden hour when people are trying to get someone to a place of help within that first hour of the tragedy. And the point here is not to cure them or to surgically heal them. It's just to pump enough blood into them and stitch them up enough to get them to the next place. And one particular case that they worked for hours on a young Marine. And finally, at the end of it, the surgeon just stumbles out and he collapses in my arms and he says, "Padre, I don't know if he's ever going to thank me. I mean, he's lost both his legs, one of his arms, part of the other. He's lost his genitals. I don't know if he'll ever thank me, but I did save his life." The amazing thing, though, is months later, that surgeon was called to Walter Reed Hospital. And there, that Marine was with his wife and his children, and they all thanked him because where there was life, there was hope. It was a powerful thing. But there wasn't anything that I could magically say to that surgeon that's going to change that. But the most powerful thing is just that I was present, that I was there, that he saw my cross, and that I was someone he could collapse into my arms, and I could listen to him and hear him and comfort him.
Yeah, that is just so important that we remember as pastors and leaders the long view of ministry. That a lot of times what we do and say doesn't bear immediate fruit, but it's something that is going to be long term. And being okay in and of ourselves as we go through this process is absolutely critical. And I love the just sort of practical physical advice that you're giving. Stay well fed and hydrated, stay moving and active and exercising and all of those things. But out of everything you just talked about, there was one thing that really jumped out to me. It was having somebody to talk to, reaching out and having somebody to talk to. I mean, I know this as a church planter and as a pastor. This can be the loneliest vocation on earth. And even though we're among many people all the time, you sometimes just feel like nobody quite understands exactly the wide breadth of experiences that you're going through from birth to death and everything in between. And I think having that trusted person that will listen to you is absolutely a critical component of self-care. And could you talk a little bit more about that, about just that kind of one-to-one spiritual direction that a chaplain would give?
Yes, I think it's the capacity to I think our circuit counselors are going to have a huge role in that. I think circuit counselors are kind of like what I was in Afghanistan. And of course, your word of trust there, I want to focus on the word trust. There has to be trust. the chaplains, the pastors, anyone you're talking to, you have to have earned the capital of trust with them. But when you've earned that capital of trust, then you are the one who can hear, and you are the one who they will open up to and talk to. And I found that with chaplains too. Not every chaplain I ever met was someone I could trust, but I worked very hard to earn, not expect it, but to earn the trust of the chaplains who worked for me. And out of that trust came their openness to me and my ability to be able to help them, and in turn make it possible for them to then help others as well. Trust is a critical component in all that.
Absolutely. Having somebody that you can trust, and that listening that you were talking about, right? What I found is with whether it's a mentor that I've had, or a particular coach, or even my spiritual director now, we often don't talk all that much together, right? We might sit in silence sometimes together, and just to have that silent presence there, trusting that I don't have to perform for this person. I don't have to tell stories, to this person to impress them or anything like that, that I can trust that they're just going to be there with me as I'm working out what's going on inside of me. And I think
we have to sometimes just bite our tongue and realize that our best laid theological formulations maybe aren't what's needed, and to be comfortable, as you say, comfortable with silence. That's hard for us. We want to fill the silence, but trusting relationships, you can have the silence, and the silence itself can be healing.
Yes, absolutely. And finding somebody that you can trust, somebody that you can talk to, somebody that you can just sit and be quiet with is really crucial, and a crucial component of self-care. I really love how you were talking about also the circuit visitors, and the circuit visitors is kind of being our local chaplains as pastors. They're the trusted person that kind of is overseeing what's happening in our region and in our area. And so you were talking prior to this call about how we pull together teams like that, what it looks like to be a part of a care kind of team like you had with the chaplains. What do you envision that looking like with circuit visitors? What would that look like?
Well, I think it has to be intentional, and it has to be deliberate. And the circuit visitor has to truly take that job seriously and carve out the time to get out there and see, call upon, to visit those pastors. And also, there's triaging even in care to pastors. I think you need to see, well, which of my pastors are facing the most in the way of who are seeing the most death, who are the ones seeing the most carnage, and those ones need to get my immediate focus. Not that everyone doesn't need to get attention, but you certainly there has to be some triaging even in care to pastors, I suspect.
Oh, that's really great advice for our CVs. I mean, they're going to have to look at everybody and keeping in regular contact. We know a lot of our circuits are meeting via Zoom and video conference like this. And I know that I'll just be on camera here, and usually I have a little bit of a conversation with whoever I'm going to record a little bit before. I'm kind of looking for some of those cues. Is there something going on? And can I ask some of those critical questions that we talked about in another video, those 4 critical questions of, what are you really afraid of right now? What's really happening, to get a little bit deeper with some of the guys, and to really help them to connect and know that there's somebody willing to listen. I just think that's absolutely crucial. A lot of our pastors feel like they're on the front line and they're all alone. So
I think it's going to be our job too, Dominic, to connect people with similar circumstances.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes, we're going to need to connect, parents who've lost a child to COVID with others, or folks who've lost parents or children, grandparents, connect them with each other. Again, I'll just give you an analogy that's buried deep in my heart. I remember one time I was visiting a young man at the hospital, after I got back to the States, and he had lost his legs, and he was having no success getting out of a deep, deep depression. And there was nothing I could say to him that had any impact at all. I mean, I viewed myself as a total failure with this young man. But then I went and talked to another Marine from the same unit who had lost both his arms. And he was bright-spirited and happy and on the road to recovery. When he heard about his buddy in the depression, he says, let me talk to him. And so we made arrangements for him to talk, the man with no arms, to speak to the man who had no legs. And when he went into the room, he said, but you have such beautiful hands. And those words coming from a man who had no arms was the beginning of the healing process for the other man. But it wasn't something that I, as a pastor, could say. It was someone who had walked a similar walk, and God could give him the grace to speak the words that need to be spoken to that individual at that time. So I think we're going to be, part of our job is going to be connecting people with similar experiences, assuming a worst case scenario here.
Wow, that is great advice. Pay attention to the people within your ministry circle that have been through different situations or are going through different situations, and find those ways to connect them with another. You don't have to carry this load yourself, pastors. I mean, you have the huge community among not only other pastors but laity as well, who have extraordinary experiences that you can tap into to take and carry some of that ministry load.
Sometimes our people minister to us as much as we do to them, even more so.
Absolutely. Well, when I met you, Rob, I was a pastor at Trinity in Temecula, and honestly, my pastor at that time was an 85-year-old member of the church who he just spoke into my heart like nobody else, and it was amazing. And I will never forget the value that I received from that, and really the care that I received from him. It was extraordinary. So want to encourage our pastors and leaders out there to really find that trusted person, find that person who's going to speak into your soul, who's going to help you care for yourself, who's going to hold you accountable to that, who's going to ask you, have you eaten today? Have you gotten out there and exercised? Have you gotten good sleep and good rest? Where's your devotional life? Are you praying? Are you talking to God? And not just preparing a sermon, right? But actually speaking with God through the power of his word. I think those are all important elements of self-care. And in quite a few of our videos, we're going to talk about more of those practices, those, I guess you'd call them spiritual disciplines or other spiritual practices that help us remain centered in Christ so that we can connect with others. And that's really what it's all about for us as leaders in the church. So I want to
when
thank
you really stop to think about it, Dominic, when you stop to think about it too, before this whole COVID-19 thing hit us, there was always a danger of isolation. And I think, pastors who isolate themselves and people who isolate themselves have problems quite apart from COVID. But this only makes it worse because we're being forced to isolate. Mm-hmm. So we have to work even harder to find ways to break through isolation so that we know we're not alone in this, both pastors and our people.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really great advice. And, we aren't alone. Ultimately, we're all going through the same thing together. Everybody's going through it. But we also know that God is with us, each one of us, individually and collectively as well. And as we stay connected to him, we'll stay connected to one another, and certainly we'll see God's church grow and expand even through this crisis. So,
and our collars and our crosses are that silent reminder of God's presence and activity, and that he's alive and well, even in the midst of the worst the world can bring our way.
Amen. Amen. I love it. Well, thank you, Rob. I really appreciate the time today, and I appreciate anybody who's watching. And if you have suggestions for other videos in the future, just shoot me a message, a private message, or a email, and be glad to oblige. Thanks, and God bless you all.